Hey there, history nerds and curious weirdos. Welcome back to Naked History. I'm Dyllan, and if you're listening to this on or near Valentine's Day, congratulations. You've survived another calendar-based emotional performance review, and you've passed. Today, we're going to be doing something simple and something mildly dangerous. We're going to be asking what Valentine's Day actually is. Because the modern holiday, cards, roses, restaurant prefix menus that look like a ransom note, feels like it has to come from somewhere specific. Well, one saint, one story, one clear origin, but if Christmas was any indication, Valentine's Day as well is not a straight line. It's a layered structure built over centuries. So here's the lens that we're using. First, we're going to be covering the martyrs named Valentine, plural on purpose. Second, the legend engine that turned a name into a romantic vibe. Next up is going to be the medieval romance ideology of courtly love and how that shaped what romantic even means. Then finally, we're going to cover the modern machine, the mass printing, postal systems, advertising, and the whole corporate ritual. So if you came here hoping for a single clean origin story, I regret to inform you that history does not come clean. History does profitable. Let's get into it, shall we? If you ever Googled who was Saint Valentine, you probably found a story that reads like this. He was a priest. He fell in love with love. He married people in secret, and he wrote letters from prison. He died for romance. The end. And, that's a great story. It's also the kind of story that should immediately trigger your naked history alarm, because it's too symmetrical, it's too perfect, it's too modern. And here's the problem. When you go back far enough, Saint Valentine isn't one person with one verified biography. It's more like a name floating through the early Christian memory attached to multiple martyr stories. Early Christianity produced martyrs the way empires produced paperwork. And I don't say that as a jab. Martyrdom mattered. It was how communities remembered identity under pressure. But the martyr tradition wasn't built to satisfy modern biography standards. It was built to teach, to inspire, and to claim a moral victory. In that world, hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, is not a neutral record. It's closer to a moral portrait than a courtroom transcript. So details blur, stories overlap, and names stack. And Valentinus isn't exactly a rare name in the Roman world. It basically means strong, healthy. It's like naming your kid Chad and hoping for the best. And over time, church tradition recognizes at least multiple Valentines associated with mid-February. A priest in Rome, a bishop linked to the region in Tourney, and sometimes other shadowy Valentines whose stories don't survive clearly. So if you're looking for the real Valentine, you're stepping into an origin vacuum. And history hates vacuums. A vacuum gets filled by stories, by symbols, by whatever version is easiest to remember, easiest to repeat, or easiest to use. Now, let's talk about feast days, because that's where the calendar begins to do its sneaky little work. The saint's feast day is, in theory, simple. It's a date assigned for liturgical remembrance. But dates aren't just spiritual, they're cultural anchors. Once a feast day exists, it becomes a kind of yearly drumbeat, repeated, referenced, and ritualized. And what's repeated becomes familiar, and what's familiar becomes meaningful. And what's meaningful becomes available for repurposing. A saint's name tied to a date becomes a hook. So you don't need a perfect biography to have a powerful commemoration. You just need the hook. And in the case of Valentine, whether one Valentine or several, February 14th becomes the hook. And then something happens that changes the whole trajectory of the holiday. The name Valentine becomes available for a new story to latch onto. A romantic story. And that brings us into Act 2. Now let's talk about how legends work. Legends aren't usually invented in one dramatic meeting where someone says, "All right, team, let's fabricate a love holiday." Legends grow like coral. They're slow, they're layered, and they're usually accidental. And then, suddenly massive. A name becomes famous for one reason or another and then gets borrowed for another. And that's what happens here. Because by the time you get to the popular Valentine legend, the story is loaded with motifs that feel almost too perfect. A priest secretly marrying couples against the emperor's orders. A letter from prison, a farewell note signed "From Your Valentine." It's a romance with the lighting pre-installed. So here's your naked fact-check moment. I'm going to do it in 3 steps: legend claim, responsible history, and why the legend persists. So first up, what the legend claims. Valentine defied an emperor who banned marriages because single men made better soldiers. Valentine married couples in secret. He was imprisoned. He fell or befriended a jailer's daughter. He wrote her a note that said, "From your Valentine." And then he was executed. Now it's cinematic. It's morally clean, it's rebellious, most importantly, it's romantic. Now, what can we responsibly say? Now, we have saint traditions and later retellings, but the most romantic details show up late and vary widely. And that should immediately tell you that you were looking at layered storytelling, not one stable early source. And so lastly, why does the legend persist anyway? Well, because it does 3 things perfectly. It turns a martyr into a romance figure, it turns state power into a villain, and it turns love into resistance. And that's irresistible for cultures that want romance to mean something beyond dinner reservations. Now, here's the deeper mechanism. Valentine is a name with an established date. And the later medieval imagination is obsessed with love stories that feel noble. So the name becomes a container, and romance gets poured directly into it. And once a story becomes culturally useful, once it explains why you're feeling something on a specific day, truth becomes a little optional. Not because people are evil, but because people want rituals to make sense. They want reason, and legends are reasons with good aesthetics. But this still doesn't fully explain why romance specifically sticks to this date, and for that we have to move to medieval Europe, where love becomes not just a feeling, but an ideology. So welcome to courtly love. Now, if the martyr is the hook, courtly love is the paint job, because by the high Middle Ages you get this cultural system, especially among elites, where love is performed like a sport. Courtly love isn't just people falling in love. It's coded devotion, longing, restraint, poetic suffering, and grand gestures. It's, "I love you so much, I will write a poem about how miserable I am." And I want to stress, this isn't necessarily how the average medieval person experienced love. This is a literary and social performance tied to courts, wealth, leisure, status. Courtly love turns romance into a language of refinement. You prove you're noble by how you desire, and that shifts everything. For those that are familiar with Pride and Prejudice, this is like the scene where Darcy flexes his hand a little bit. That is the symbol of courtly love. And so, because once love is performative, it becomes reproducible. It becomes teachable, and it becomes something you can imitate even if your real life looks nothing like it. Now there's the core tension that matters for Valentine's Day. Courtly love is about longing, it's about distance, it's about coded devotion. Marriage, especially medieval marriage, is often about property, alliances, inheritance, and survival. Marriage is a legal and economic institution. Courtly love is more of a social aesthetic. And those aren't always friends. Because sometimes courtly love sits outside marriage, in literature, in flirtation, in forbidden longing, because the marriage itself is structured by family strategy. Sometimes affection exists within marriage too, absolutely. Humans are humans, but the idea that marriage is primarily a romantic choice is not medieval default. And so what happens? Well, the culture creates two tracks. On one track, marriage is structure, and on another is romance as fantasy. And Valentine's Day eventually becomes the date romance can borrow. And so now the famous pivot you'll hear about is Chaucer. In the late 1300s, you get one of the earliest known literary connection between St. Valentine's Day and lovers. A poem about birds choosing mates, romance framed as seasonal destiny. And once that association appears in elite literature, it's like striking a match near dry tinder. It doesn't immediately create the modern holiday, but it does create the idea that mid-February can be a romantic date. Which is honestly a wild choice if you live in England, where February is basically wet depression with extra mud. But literature doesn't care about weather, literature cares about symbolism. So now to this point we have a saint's date, a romantic ideology, and a narrative culture that loves love stories. So all it needs now is repetition. Which brings us to the cultural glue. Now here's the thing about traditions. They don't have to be logical, they just have to be repeated. A date becomes sticky when it gets reinforced from multiple directions. The church calendar marks it, poets reference it, social custom grows around it, and then communities repeat it. And over time, the original reason becomes less important than the feeling attached to it. So Valentine's Day doesn't become romantic because one pope flipped a switch and declared, "Let there be love poems." It becomes romantic the way many holidays come to become what they are, through layering. A little saint story here, a little poetic association there, a sprinkling of folk custom, and a dash of seasonal symbolism. And over the centuries, you start getting references to Valentine's as a moment for choosing, for pairing, for courtship, especially in the English-speaking world. Because humans love rituals for emotions that they can't control. The day associated with romance becomes a social container or a permission slip, a day when longing can be expressed with rules. And this is where we should talk about the common Lupercalia connection. You may have heard a claim that Valentine's Day is basically a Christian replacement for the Roman fertility festival. Now, there's a real Roman festival around mid-February called Lupercalia, and people have a pagan origin story love. But historians tend to treat the direct replacement narrative with caution, because there isn't strong evidence that Valentine's Day romance traditions are directly inherited from Lupercalia. The more reliable arc is that Valentine's gets romantic association much later in medieval culture. In other words, the romance layer is medieval, not Roman. Which means you can't blame the ancient Romans for the Walgreens card aisle. That's actually all on us. So by this point in the story, we have a cultural container. Valentine's Day exists, romance imagery exists, and courtly love language exists. Now the final ingredient arrives. A modern one, actually, and it is industrial capitalism. Because once you can mass-produce intimacy, the holiday itself becomes a marketplace. Now this is where Valentine's Day becomes recognizably modern. Not because humans suddenly discovered romance, but because humans discovered scale. If courtly love is the ideology, the industrial age is the distribution system. Once printing becomes cheap and widespread, you can mass-produce cards. And once postal systems become more reliable, you can send them, and once literacy rises and consumer culture expands, you can sell the ritual itself. Valentine's Day becomes a ready-made calendar event with emotional demand built in. And businesses love emotional demand, because emotional demand is urgent. Nobody wants to be the person who forgot. Nobody wants to be the person who did nothing, and nothing starts to look like a statement now. So standardized cards become scalable intimacy. You can buy your feelings pre-phrased, pre-decorated, pre-approved, and the more standardization the ritual becomes, the more the holiday turns into an annual test. Did you demonstrate properly? Did you perform love? Did you buy the props? And this is the transformation that puts off a lot of people. The commercialization turns those feelings into proof. A card becomes evidence, flowers become evidence, a dinner reservation becomes evidence. Not, I love you, but here's a receipt for my love. And if you think I'm exaggerating, consider how many modern Valentine's Day scripts sound like compliance. You don't even have to want the ritual for it to act on you, because capitalism is extremely good at turning optional feelings into obligations. And the pressure cooker intensifies it tenfold. Love becomes performance plus purchase, which can be sweet, sure, but can also be exhausting. Because the holiday doesn't just ask, do you love someone? It asks, do you love someone correctly, on schedule, and with the correct accessories? It's like being pulled into a manager's office and being asked if you hit your quarterly love ratings. So now we've layered martyrdom, legend, courtly love ideology, and industrial production and marketing. And what we get is the modern Valentine's Day, a cultural expectation that shows up every February like a debt collector in a tuxedo. Which brings us to the final act, what we're really buying. So, if you strip away all the layers, Valentine's Day isn't really about one saint. It's about what humans do with dates. A calendar is a vacuum begging to be filled, and we fill it with meaning so we can make sense of time. And the meaning that we attach to things are rarely neutral. It's shaped by power, by culture, by economics. Martyrdom itself became marketing because myths are useful. A saint's name gives you legitimacy, a love legend gives you emotion, courtly love gives you a script, and industrial capitalism gives you an aisle. And then the holiday itself becomes self-sustaining. Because once a ritual is established, you don't need an origin story to survive. It just needs social expectation. Now that's the real engine, not one Valentine, but the need for humans to have a story, and the market's ability to sell it back to us. And here's the naked history point. You don't have to hate Valentine's Day to understand it. You can enjoy the roses and recognize the system. You can love the ritual and admit it's been overly monetized. You can be romantic and still rip that fig leaf off of the holiday's origin story. Because the goal isn't cynicism about history or the holidays that we celebrate, it's clarity. So you can choose what you want from the holiday, instead of letting the holiday choose for you. Alright, you history nerds and curious weirdos, here's where I want to hand this back to you. Because Valentine's Day is one of those holidays that reveals more about the present than the past. So here's the question, what is the weirdest romantic obligation that you've ever felt pressured into? Not the sweetest, not the most romantic, but the weirdest. The why does society want me to do this on a Tuesday in February kind of obligation. Was it matching outfits, a public post with the correct caption, a gift that felt less like love and more like you were paying a toll? And second, what's one Valentine's Day tradition that you would actually keep if it wasn't marketed to death? Like if capitalism backed away slowly, hands up, and said, oh, okay, you can have love without the product bundle, what would you keep? Would you keep the handwritten notes, cooking together a cheap movie night, a walk, dumb inside joke tradition? Because that's the part that's worth protecting. Not the myth, not the pressure, and definitely not the receipts, but the human part. And if you like this episode, share it with your favorite romance skeptic, your favorite history gremlin, or the friend who insists Valentine's Day was invented by Hallmark like it's a personal conspiracy theory. Hint, it was. And if you haven't already, follow Naked History wherever you listen, and leave a review because those are oxygen for this show. If you want to leave a review that feels extremely on brand, you can write, "This podcast made me rethink chocolate." Yeah, that works. Next time, we're going to be back with more history that looks normal until you stare at it long enough and it starts making weird little gremlin noises. So, as always, stay curious, stay weird, and stay naked. Historically speaking. Have a good one, and we'll see you in the debrief.